On the Life of Plotinus and the Order of his Books, by Porphyry of Tyre. Plotinus, the philosopher active during our own lifetime, gave the impression of being embarrassed about having a body. He certainly could not stand talking about his race, his parents, or his original homeland. He so disliked the idea of being painted or sculpted that when Emilius asked him to allow an image to be made, he said, "Isn't it enough that I have to carry around the image that nature has clothed me with?" Did he have to consent to leave behind a longer-lasting image of this image, as if it was something worth looking at? Since he made it clear that for this reason he would refuse to sit for a portrait, Emilius got Carterius, the best painter of his generation, who happened to be his friend, to come to Plotinus's seminar and meet him. Anyone who wanted was allowed to attend these seminars. Emilius had him concentrate on looking at Plotinus so that, over time, he acquired a clear mental image of him. He then drew a picture of this image, and thus laid it down in his memory. Emilius corrected the sketch to make it as true to life as possible, and in this way the skill of Carterius furnished us with a very close likeness of Plotinus, and Plotinus knew nothing about it. He often suffered from bowel trouble, but would not tolerate having an enema. He said it was not appropriate for an old man to undergo that sort of therapy. He would not agree to take medicines derived from wild animals either. He did not, he said, want to derive nourishment from the bodies even of domesticated animals. He stayed away from the baths, but used to be rubbed down daily at home, until, during a severe outbreak of plague, the people who rubbed him down were among those who died. He gave up the treatment then, but soon afterwards became afflicted with terrible throat infections. While I was with him, he never showed symptoms of anything of the sort, but after I went away, he got the illness so badly that when I got back, Eustochius, a friend who was with him until he died, told me that he lost the clarity and depth of his voice, his sight was blurred, and his feet and hands ulcerated. This meant that his friends, of whom he always wanted to ask questions, had to be turned away. So he left the city for Zethus's estate in Campania. Zethus was an old friend of his who had died. His needs were supplied from Zethus's estate, or brought from that of Castricius in Minturno. Minturno was where Castricius had his property. When he was on the verge of death, Eustochius was slow in getting to him, as he told us, because he was staying in Puteoli. Quote, "I have been hanging on for you," said Plotinus. He breathed his last with the words, quote, "tried to elevate the God within us to the divine in the universe," unquote. And a snake slid under the bed in which he lay and disappeared into a hole that happened to be there in the wall. It was toward the end of the second year of Claudius's reign, and he was 66, so Eustochius said. When he died, I, Porphyry, happened to be residing in Lilybaeus. Emilius was in Apamea, in Syria, and Castricius was in Rome. Only Eustochius was with him. Counting backwards 66 years from the second year of Claudius's reign, CE 270, Plotinus's birth falls in the 13th year of the reign of Severus, CE 204. But he never revealed to anyone the month of his birth, or when his birthday was, since he did not think that anyone should sacrifice or hold a feast for him, although he would himself sacrifice and hold feasts for his companions on the traditional birthdays of Plato and Socrates, when he would require those who could to read out a discourse in front of everyone present. He, however, quite spontaneously offered information about himself when he was in company, such as the fact that he used to go to his nurse, bare her breasts, and ask to suckle, even when he was 7 years old and going to school. He was, however, shamed into stopping when she once called him an obnoxious brat. He was attracted to philosophy at the age of 27, and went to the best-regarded philosophers in Alexandria, but he came away from their lectures depressed and miserable. He told one of his friends what was wrong, and the friend, who understood what his soul was yearning for, took him off to hear Ammonius, whom he had not yet tried. When Plotinus saw and heard him, he said to his friend, quote, "This is the man I was looking for," unquote. From that day he remained with Ammonius constantly. He acquired such a philosophical disposition that he became keen to try and learn the philosophy practiced among the Persians, too, and the system perfected by the Indians. When the Emperor Gordian was about to lead a campaign against the Persians, he signed up for it and went with him. He was 38 then, having been studying with Ammonius for 11 years. Gordian was wiped out in Mesopotamia, and Plotinus only just escaped to safety in Antioch. Philip took power, and Plotinus, then aged 40, went up to Rome. Irenaeus, Origen, and Plotinus had made pacts not to reveal the doctrines that Ammonius expounded in his lectures, and Plotinus, although he took pupils of his own, took care to keep the doctrines of Ammonius to himself. Irenaeus was the first to violate the pact, and once he had done so, Origen followed suit, though Origen wrote nothing except the treatise On Daimons, and a treatise dedicated to Gallienus called That the King is the Only Creator. Plotinus wrote nothing for a long time, though he gave talks based on his seminars with Ammonius, and so he spent 10 whole years running seminars of his own but writing nothing. Since he encouraged those who attended to ask questions, his talks were, as Emilius told us, very disorderly and unstructured. Emilius went to Plotinus in the 3rd year of Philip's reign, CE 245/6, and stayed until the 1st year of Claudius's, CE 268/9, so that he was with him for 24 whole years. When he arrived, he had a disposition shaped by the seminars he had taken with Lysimachus, but he was more hard-working than any of his contemporaries, shown by the fact that he had written out and assembled pretty well the whole of Numenius, and learnt most of it by heart. He wrote commentaries based on Plotinus's seminars, and composed 100 or so books of notes, which he bestowed upon Hostilianus Hesychius of Apamea, his adopted son. In the 10th year of the reign of Gallienus, CE 262, Porphyry, came from Greece with Antony of Rhodes, and got to know Emilius, who was by then in his 18th year with Plotinus. He had not yet found the ambition to write anything except the notes, and they did not yet extend to 100 books. In the 10th year of the reign of Gallienus, Plotinus was around 59. When I, Porphyry, first met him, I was 30. Plotinus had turned to writing on topics that occurred to him in the 1st year of Gallienus's reign. By the 10th year of Gallienus's reign, when I, Porphyry, first got to know him, he had written 21 books. I found out that even they had not been circulated widely. At this time, he did not find it an easy matter to give out copies. He felt a sense of responsibility, and would not do it just like that, without a second thought, but only after a careful assessment of the recipients. He did not give these works titles, and they were known by various titles given by different people. The following are the generally accepted titles. 1. On Beauty. 2. On the Immortality of the Soul. 3. On Fate. 4. On the Substantiality of the Soul. 5. On Intellect, Ideas, and Being. 6. On the Descent of Souls into Bodies. 7. How that which is after the first comes from the first, and on the One. 8. On whether all souls are one. 9. On the Good, or the One. 10. On the 3 primary hypostases. 11. On the generation and order of the things which come after the first. 12. On the 2 kinds of matter. 13. Various considerations. 14. On the circular motion. 15. On our allotted daimon. 16. On existing from the body. 17. On quality. 18. On whether or not there are ideas of individuals. 19. On virtues. 20. On dialectic. 21. How the soul is said to be a mean between undivided and divided being. These are the 21 works that he was found to have written when Porphyry first came to him. Plotinus was then 59. I, Porphyry, was with him for this year and the following 5 years without a break, for I came to Rome a little before the end of Gallienus's first 10 years in power. It was summer, and Plotinus was not working, but he still held gatherings. In these 6 years we explored many topics in our seminars. Emilius and I asked him to write, and he wrote. 22 and 23. That being one and identical is simultaneously everywhere whole. 2 books. 24. On the fact that which transcends being does not think, and what the primary thinking is, and what is secondary. 25. On potentially and actually. 26. On the impassibility of things without body. 27. On the soul 1. 28. On the soul 2. 29. On the soul 3. 30. On contemplation. 31. On the intelligible beauty. 32. On the intellect, and that the intelligibles are not outside of the intellect, and on the one. 33. Against the Gnostics. 34. On numbers. 35. On how it is that distant things appear small. 36. On whether happiness increases with time. 37. On complete blending. 38. How the multiplicity of ideas came to exist, and on the good. 39. On the voluntary. 40. On the cosmos. 41. On sense perception and on memory. 42. On the genera of being one. 43. On the genera of being two. 44. On the genera of being three. 45. On eternity and time. These works, 24 of them, he wrote in the 6-year period when I, Porphyry, was with him, taking his topics from questions he was engaged with at the time, something I made clear in my key point summaries for each work. Added to the 21 works he wrote before we arrived, that makes 45 in all. While I spent time in Sicily, I went there around the 15th year of Gallienus's reign, AD 267. Plotinus wrote these 5 works and sent them to me. 46 on the happiness, 47 on providence 1, 48 on providence 2, 49 on the knowing hypostases and on that which is transcendent, 50 on love. So he sent me these in the 1st year of the reign of Claudius. At the beginning of the 2nd, shortly before he was about to die, he sent these 4. 51 on what evils are, 52 on whether the stars are causes, 53 what is the living being, 54 on happiness. The first 2 blocks make up 45 works, bringing the number to 54. Some of them, then, were written when he was young, others when he was at the height of his powers, and others when he was physically unwell. The power of the books reflects this. The first 21 is somewhat lacking in power, not powerful enough to have real impact. But the middle period of published works clearly reveals the height of his power. These 24 works could not, apart from the short ones, be better. The last 9 were written when his power was already on the wane, and more so the final 4 than the 5 before them. He had a large following, and people with a thirst for philosophy gathered around him. They included Emilius of Tuscany, whose family name was Gentilianus. Plotinus preferred to call him Amirius with an R. He said that it was more appropriate for him to be called partless, Amerios, than careless, Amelios. There was a doctor from Scythopolis called Paulinus, who Emilius nicknamed Mikalos because he always struck the wrong note. There was another doctor, Eustochius of Alexandria, who got to know him toward the end of his life and stayed in his service until his death, studying only with Plotinus's circle. He acquired the disposition of a true philosopher. There was also with him Zoticus, the critic and poet, who edited the text of Antimachus and rendered the story of Atlantis into verse, very poetically. He lost his sight and died shortly before Plotinus. Paulinus also died before Plotinus. One of his companions was Zethus, an Arab by extraction. He had married the daughter of Theodosius, who was friends with Ammonius. He, too, was a doctor and devoted to Plotinus. He was interested in politics and had political inclinations, which Plotinus tried to check. They were like family, and Plotinus used to stay with him at his estate, which was some 6 miles this side of Minturnae. Castricius, known as Firmus, had bought it. He was the greatest connoisseur alive during our lifetime, and revered Plotinus. He was also a good servant to Emilius, serving him in all things, and he was attached to me, Porphyry, and treated me in all matters like a brother. He too revered Plotinus, then, even though he had chosen a political life. Quite a few senators attended his lectures. Marcellus Orontius and Sabinillus in particular worked at philosophy. Another senator, was Rogantianus, who came to reject this life to such an extent that he gave up his possessions, dismissed his slaves, and resigned his position. He was due to be inducted into the office of praetor. The lictors were even there. But he not only refused to go on, he resigned all public office. After he relinquished the management of his own household as well, he would dine and sleep at the houses of various friends and acquaintances, only eating every other day. As a result of his renunciation and abstinence, he recovered from his gout, which had been so severe that he used to be carried about in a chair. And whereas before he could not stretch out his fingers, he became more agile than craftsmen used to working with their hands. Plotinus took him into his inner circle and was full of praise for him, eventually adducing him as a good example for philosophers. Serapion of Alexander was with him too, originally an orator, but afterwards also interested in philosophical argument, but he did not stay the course. He found himself unable to renounce his possessions and give up usury. I, Porphyry of Tyre, was also a friend of Plotinus, admitted to his inner circle. He asked me to edit his writings, for he himself, once he had written something, could not bear to revisit it a second time. Indeed, he could not even read it through once, since his eyesight made reading difficult. He wrote without aiming for beauty in the individual letters, without keeping syllables distinct, and without any concern for spelling. All he minded about was the meaning, and he kept writing until his death, which amazed us all. He would go through the whole issue by himself from beginning to end, then he would commit his argument to writing, getting down what he had worked out in his soul without hesitation, as if he were copying the writing out of a book. He could conduct a conversation with someone about another issue, and keep on top of the conversation without ever taking his mind from the matter he was thinking about. When the person he was talking to left, he would not read over what he had already written. As I said, his sight was not up to reading. He would simply move to the next point, continuing the text as if the conversation had been no interruption at all. So he kept his own company at the same time as being with others, and never relaxed his attention to himself, or his constant reversion to intellect. If he did so, it was only when he slept, and he did that very little thanks to his modest diet. Often he would not eat any bread. Plotinus also attracted women who were devoted to philosophy. There was Jemina, in whose house he lived, and her daughter, who like her mother was called Jemina, and there was Amphiclea, who was the wife of Ariston, son of Iamblichus, also devoted to philosophy. Furthermore, a number of men and women of the highest social order brought their male and female offspring to him when they were about to die. They would entrust them to him, along with what remained of their property, treating his protection as sacred and godlike. For this reason, Plotinus's house was full of boys and girls, among them Potamo, whose education he took such pains over that he would often listen even to revisions of his compositions. He would minutely scrutinize the accounts submitted by their trustees, and insisted that as long as they did not take up philosophy, their possessions and revenues should remain untouched and secure. Plotinus, then, although he never relaxed his mental concentration so long as he was awake, undertook his share of responsibility for the lives and concerns of other people, many of them. He was, to those who had any dealings with him, kind and accessible. For this reason, although he lived for 26 whole years in Rome, and acted as arbiter in many cases of personal dispute, he never made a single enemy in his public life. Among those with pretensions to philosophy it was different. Olympius of Alexandria, who had studied with Ammonius for a while, wanted to be preeminent as a philosopher and hated him. He used magic to attack him, trying to get him starstruck. When he realized that the attempt had only rebounded on himself, he said to his acquaintances that the power of Plotinus's soul was so great that he could deflect attacks made against him onto those who were trying to do him harm. Plotinus, for his part, was aware of Olympius's efforts, and said that his body then felt like, quote, a purse being drawn shut, unquote, his limbs being pressed together. Olympius saw that he would suffer much worse things himself than anything he could hope to do to Plotinus, and gave up trying. Plotinus did indeed have some natural endowment that set him apart. An Egyptian priest once came to Rome and met him through a mutual friend. Wanting to give a demonstration of his wisdom, he invited Plotinus to come and see him summon his guardian daimon. Plotinus readily agreed, and the invocation took place in the temple of Isis, since the Egyptians said that this was the only pure place he could find in Rome. When he called upon Plotinus's daimon to appear, it was a god that came, rather than a member of the genus of daimons. As the Egyptians said, quote, "You are blessed, since you have a god as your daimon, and are not accompanied by a member of the lower genus." Unquote. They were not able to ask or learn more while it was there, since one of their friends, who was watching with them, strangled the birds he was holding as protection, whether deliberately, through envy, or in a moment of panic. In any case, the fact that Plotinus was accompanied by a daimon of superior divinity led him to raise his godlike vision toward it. This is why he wrote the book, On Our Allotted Daimon, in which he tries to explain why different people have different guardians. Emilius was fond of sacrifices, and used to busy himself with rites of the new moon, and rites to allay fears. He once tried to get Plotinus to participate with him, but Plotinus said, "They must come to me, not I to them." We did not know what consideration led him to make such a grand pronouncement, and did not have the nerve to ask him. He was possessed of an extraordinary degree of insight. Once, when Chione had a very valuable necklace stolen, Chione was a pious widow who lived with him along with her children. The slaves were brought before his view. He looked at them all. "This is the thief," he said, pointing to one of them. The man was whipped, and for a long time denied it, but eventually he confessed, fetched what he had stolen, and returned it. Plotinus would foretell how each of the children living with him would turn out. For example, he said what Polemo would be like, amorous and short-lived, and so he was. And once he saw me, Porphyry, when I was thinking about ending my life. He suddenly presented himself to me while I was spending time at home, and said that this desire of mine was not the product of considered thought, but of pathological melancholy, and he told me to leave town. I obeyed him and went to Sicily, since I had heard that a well-known man called Probus was staying near Lilybaeum. I was cured of my urge, but was prevented from being with Plotinus for the rest of his life. Gallienus the emperor and his wife Salanina honored and revered Plotinus greatly. On the strength of his friendship with them, Plotinus asked them to rebuild a certain city in Campania, once said to have been a city of philosophers which had fallen into ruins. He asked them to bestow the surrounding countryside on the city once it had been repopulated. The idea was that the inhabitants would live according to Plato's laws, and the city would be called Platonopolis. Plotinus promised that he and his companions would move there, and the philosopher would very easily have had his wish, were it not that some of the emperor's court stood in his way, whether through envy or resentment, or some other unworthy cause. In our seminars, Plotinus was a fluent speaker, and very good at thinking through problems and finding ways through them, but sometimes he got words wrong. He would not say remember, but merember, and there were other oddities of pronunciation which he replicated in his writing too. When he spoke, his intellect was manifest, even in the way it lit up his face. He was handsome to look at, but even more beautiful in those moments. He perspired a bit, he exuded kindliness, his face looked gentle, but also intellectually rigorous when he was questioned. For 3 days, I, Porphyry, questioned his account of the sense in which the soul was in the body, and he patiently went through the arguments. Someone called Thormasius, who was studying universal propositions, joined the seminar and wanted to hear Plotinus speaking on texts. He could not stem Porphyry's responding and questioning. However, Plotinus said, "But if we cannot solve Porphyry's difficulties when he asks them, how will we be able to say anything at all when faced with the text?" Plotinus's writing is concise but packed with meaning, brief and more abundant in ideas than in words, inspiring and passionate about almost everything, a combination of personal insight and respect for tradition. Stoic and peripatetic doctrines are blended into his writings, though they are not obvious, and it contains the concentrated essence of Aristotle's metaphysics. No so-called geometrical or arithmetical theorem evaded him, nor those of mechanics, optics, or music, though he himself was not specially trained to work in these areas. In our seminars, he would have commentaries read out, those of Severus, Cronius, Numenius, Gaius, or Atticus, or, from the Peripatetics, those of Aspasius, Alexander, and Adrastus, and whoever was to hand. None of these was given the last word. he always had his own view. His way of thinking was distinctive, and he adopted Ammonius's mindset in his enquiries. It was not long before he had heard enough to find a profound issue to apply his mind to. Once Longinus's On First Principles was read to him, and his Antiquity lover. Quote, Longinus is a philologist, he said, but not at all a philosopher. Unquote. On another occasion, Origen appeared at a seminar. Plotinus blushed deeply and wanted to leave. Origen asked him to keep speaking, but he said that all desire to do so is crushed when the speaker sees that he is speaking to those who know what he was going to say, and so he said a little and left. I read a poem called The Holy Marriage at the feast for Plato, and because a lot of it was expressed obliquely, in the mystical language of inspiration, someone said, Porphyry is mad. In everyone's hearing, he said to me, You proved yourself to be at once poet, philosopher, and priest. The rhetorician Diophanes read out a piece justifying Alcibiades as he appears in Plato's Symposium, arguing that as a price for an education in virtue, a pupil should make himself sexually available if his teacher wanted it. Plotinus kept starting up to leave the gathering, but refrained from doing so. After the lecture broke up, he charged me, Porphyry, to write a counter-argument. Diophanes did not want to give me his text, so I based my response on my memory of his lines of argument. When I read it to a gathering of the same audience, Plotinus was so happy with me that in our seminars he would constantly add, quote, Shoot like this if you want to illuminate men, unquote. That's from Homer's Iliad. Eubulus, Plato's successor in Athens, sent Plotinus treatises concerning certain questions of Platonic interpretation. He caused them to be given to me, asking me to think of answers and to let him know what I thought. Plotinus dealt with astronomical tables, though not in great technical detail. He addressed the efficacy of horoscopes more closely, and in the many places where he saw something unwarranted in what the treatises claimed, he did not hold back from refutation. During his lifetime, Christianity attracted a diverse popular following, as did movements which drew on ancient philosophy. Followers of Adelphius and Aquinas got hold of most of the writings of Alexander of Libya, Philocomus, Demostratus, and Leidus, and published the revelations of Zoroaster, Zostrianus, Nicotheus, Allogenes, and Messus. There were others of the sort. They deceived many people. Indeed, they were themselves deluded, as if Plato had not come to grips with the profundity of intelligible substance. Plotinus himself refuted them on many points in the course of our seminars, and he wrote a book which we called Against the Gnostics, but he left it to us to judge the rest. Aemilius managed to write 40 books against the Book of Zostrianus. I, Porphyry, composed a continuous series of arguments against the Book of Zoroaster, proving beyond doubt that it is a recent forgery fabricated by the sect's adherents to give the impression that the doctrines they themselves approve are those of the ancient Zoroaster. Some people from Greece said that Plotinus had been presenting as his own the doctrines of Numenius. Trypho, the Stoic and Platonist, told Aemilius this, and Aemilius wrote a book which he called On Plotinus's Doctrinal Distance from Numenius. He dedicated it to Basileus, meaning me. Basileus is another way of referring to me instead of Porphyry. In my native language I am called Malchus, which was the name my father had, but Malchus, translated into Greek, is Basileus, meaning king. This is why Longinus, when he dedicated his On Impulse to Cleodemus and me, Porphyry, wrote to Cleodemus and Malchus. So Aemilius translated my name, and just as Numenius changed Maximus, greatest, to Megalos, great, so he changed Malchus to Basileus. This is what he wrote. Quote, Aemilius to Basileus, greetings. You know very well that I would not have said a word just because certain fine gentlemen have been spreading the view that the doctrines of our friend derive from Numenius of Apamea, a view which you say has reached your own hearing. It is too obvious that it is an example of the sort of glib and specious position they revere so much. First of all, they say that he is a complete fool, then they say that he is a plagiarist, and finally they accuse him of dealing with trivialities. It is obvious that their attacks are just satire, but you think that we should use the occasion of their attack to set down our beliefs, to make them easier for us to recall, and at the same time to make both them and the name of our friend, the great Plotinus, more widely known, though they have for a long time been in the public domain. For this reason, I hereby present my account, worked up in 3 days, as you already know. You must forgive me for the fact that I have not been guided by his own writings in my composition, or in the selection of topics, but went back to when we used to meet, and put things down in the order they happened to arise. The main reason I did this was that Plotinus has been brought to trial here by certain people for an outlook which he shares with us, an outlook which is not easy to pick up from his published work, because of his tendency to treat of the same topics in different ways in different places as he sees fit. I'm sure that, if I end up defacing any of the doctrines, all of which I've gone to our shared philosophical home to find, you'll be kind enough to put me right. As the tragedy says somewhere, I felt like a, quote, meddler correcting and disclaiming, when faced with an account of our leader's doctrines, which is so far from the truth. But that only shows how great was my wish to please you completely. Farewell. Unquote. I decided to set out this letter to substantiate the claim that there were those who, during his lifetime, thought that Plotinus made his reputation by passing off Numenius's doctrines as his own. I also did it to show that they thought him a complete fool, being contemptuous of him because they did not understand what he said, and because he avoided boastful rhetorical displays. They thought that he treated his seminars like social gatherings, and was slow to spell out the logical steps of his argument. I, Porphyry, got a similar impression when I first heard him. That is why I published a work against him, in which I tried to show that the intelligible lies outside the intellect. Plotinus made Emilius read it out, and when he had done so, laughed and said, "Your job is to solve the problems into which he has fallen because he does not know what we think." Emilius wrote quite a large work against the difficulties raised by Porphyry. I replied to this, and Emilius responded in his turn. At the third go, I, Porphyry, finally managed to understand what he was saying, and wrote a retraction, which I read out in a lecture. From then on, I put my faith in Plotinus's books, and encouraged a desire in him, as my teacher, to set out his views in writing at greater length. He made Emilius keen to write as well. Longinus's opinion of Plotinus, which was largely based on what I told him myself in my letters to him, can be seen from the following extract of a letter which he wrote to me. He was asking me to leave Sicily and go to him in Phoenicia, bringing the books of Plotinus, and this is what he said. Quote, "Send them as soon as you think best, or, better still, bring them, for I am not going to stop asking you again and again to take the road that leads to me rather than the road that leads away. If for no other reason, for what wisdom could you expect to find here? Then come for old time's sake, and for the air, which is ideal for the physical infirmity you speak about. You may have something else in mind, but don't expect to find anything at all new here, nor, for that matter, those things from the past you say you have lost. There is such a scarcity of writers here that I have, by the gods, only just managed to get a hold of the remaining works of Plotinus by taking my copyist away from his usual work, and setting him to work on this single task. And I have acquired what appears to be everything, including everything that you have been sending, but what I have is half finished, for it has more than the usual number of errors. I thought our friend Emilius would remove the scribal errors, but he had more urgent matters to attend to, so I do not know how I can get to grips with them. I am very keen to examine On the Soul and On Being, but these are more corrupt than any. I would dearly like to get accurately written copies from you, just for checking, then I would send them back. Or, again, I shall make the same argument. Don't send them, but I would much rather you bring them yourself, these and anything else that Emilius might have missed. I have been careful to acquire everything he brought. Would I not want to keep his commentaries, worthy as they are of all reverence and honor? I told you, when you were here, and a long way away, and spending time around Tyre, that I have not been able to go along with many of his suggestions, but I am impressed by the character of the writing, by the density of the man's thoughts, and by the extraordinarily philosophical disposition of the enquiries. I love them, and I would say that seekers ought to consider his books among the most outstanding." Unquote. These things I repeat at length from the greatest critic of our lifetime. a man who discussed almost everything written by all of his other contemporaries. It shows how he came to view Plotinus, although at first, influenced by the ignorance of others, he had been disdainful of him. He thought that the books he had got from Emilius were corrupt because he did not understand the man's usual form of expression. Emilius's copies of Plotinus had certainly been corrected by comparison with the autographs. To give a full picture of Longinus's assessment of Plotinus, Emilius and his other contemporaries, so that one can see what one of the best-known and leading critics thought of them, it is necessary to quote from his book. The book is called Longinus against Plotinus and Gentilianus Emilius, on the end. And this is the preface. There have, Marcellus, been many philosophers in my time, not least in the early days of my youth. It is impossible to describe their rarity in this field now, but when I was still a boy, there were quite a few outstanding philosophers, all of whom, it so happens, I got to see because from a young age I travelled widely with my parents. And I got to know those who lived long enough by having a lot to do with their tribes and cities. Some of them tried to treat of their views in books, leaving to their successors something from which they could derive their help, but others thought it enough to lead their pupils to grasp them for themselves. The first group includes the Platonists Euclides, Democritus, and Proclinus, who spent time in the Troad, and among those still living in Rome, Plotinus and Gentilianus Emilius, his friend. The Stoics, Themistocles and Phoebio, and Annius and Medius, who flourished until recently, and the peripatetic Heliodorus of Alexandria. The second group includes the Platonists Ammonius and Origen, with whom we spent most of our time, men who were more than a little superior in their contemporaries to their contemporaries in understanding, and the successors in Athens, Theodotus and Eubulus. There were things written by these men. Origen wrote on daimons, and Eubulus on the Philebus and the Gorgias and Aristotle's criticisms of Plato's Republic, but not enough to make them count as writers. It was an occasional activity for them, and not their principal interest. Stoics in this second group include Hermanus and Lysimachus, and Athenaeus and Musonius, who lived in town. Peripatetics include Ammonius and Ptolemy, outstanding in their day as philologists, especially Ammonius. No one as learned as him was ever born. They didn't write any technical manuals, but poems and epideictic speeches, and I don't think any of those would have survived if it had been a matter of their own wishes, for they would not have been able to bear the idea of finding fame later on for books like this, when they had not gone to the trouble of preserving their views in more serious writings. Among this group of writers, some wrote little more than compilations and transcriptions from the writings of their predecessors, so Euclides, Democritus, and Proclinus. Others tried to write on the same topics as the ancients, but focused on very minor aspects of their inquiries. They include Annius, Medius, and Phoebio, the latter preferring to be known for the words he used rather than the organization of his thought. One might place Heliodorus in their company too, because he added little to what his teachers had said beyond correcting their language. But there were others who manifested their eagerness to write, both in the number of questions which they tackled and their individual manner of thinking about them. They include Plotinus and Gentilianus Emilius, whose account of what seemed to be Pythagorean and Platonic principles made for clearer exegesis than any of their predecessors. The writings of Numenius and Cronius, and Moderatus and Thrasyllus could not touch those of Plotinus for clarity. Emilius chose to follow in his footsteps and held most of the same beliefs, but was his antithesis in the expansive way in which he worked through them and in the roundabout style of his expression. These are the only people whose writings I think are worth considering. As to the rest, why should one be bothered with them at the expense of those works on which they rely, and to which they add nothing, not a single line of argument, let alone any substantive point? They simply collect the opinions of the majority, or the judgments of the superior. This is something I have said already elsewhere, for example, in answering Gentilianus on Plato's view of justice, or in examining Plotinus's On Ideas. Our mutual Tyrian friend Basileus, who has himself written a few works in the manner of Plotinus, for whom he left our school, wrote a work in which he tried to show that Plotinus held a better view about the ideas than the one I hold. I think I wrote a suitable response, showing the flaws in his decision to leave my school, and at the same time dispatching many views held by these men. Likewise, in my letter to Emilius, which is the length of a monograph, and addresses everything that he wrote to me from Rome, he himself called this letter on the manner of Plotinus's philosophy, but I prefer to know it just by its common title, Letter to Emilius. So, when he wrote this, he agreed that all of those active during his lifetime, Plotinus and Emilius most manifested their eagerness to write, both in the number of questions which they tackled and their individual manner of thinking about them, that Plotinus did not pass off Numenius's doctrines as his own, and that rather than having most regard for the doctrines of Numenius, he actually pursued and took up the doctrines of the Pythagoreans, and that the writings of Numenius and Cronius and Moderatus and Thrasyllus could not touch those of Plotinus for clarity. Of Emilius he says that he chose to follow in his footsteps and held most of the same beliefs, but was his antithesis in the expansive way in which he worked through them and in the roundabout style of his expression. He also mentions me, Porphyry, then still at the beginning of my attendance at Plotinus's seminars. Our mutual Tyrian friend Basileus, he says, has himself written a few works in the manner of Plotinus. He wrote this because I was careful to avoid the unphilosophical prolixity of Emilius's writings, and was keen to write in the style of Plotinus. What this great man, unsurpassed for his work as a critic and commentator, wrote about Plotinus is impressive enough, and he would have had nothing at all to say against him if I, Porphyry, had been able to go and see him when he asked me, and put him right about the doctrine of Plotinus. But what is all this about oak and rock, as Hesiod says? If we are looking for witnesses from among the number of the wise, no one could be wiser than God, the God who said, I know the number of the sand and the measure of the sea, and I understand the deaf and hear the dumb. Emilius asked Apollo where the soul of Plotinus had gone. Apollo, who simply said of Socrates, Socrates is the wisest of all men. Listen to what he said, and at what great length, about Plotinus. Quote, the hymn I shall play is fit for the gods. Its subject is a kindly friend, its tune a tapestry of honey hues. It is played on a lyre with a golden pick. And I summon the muses to join my song, to cry Iake with all their might, and overwhelm with their music, as they did when summoned to start up the dance for Alcides, with the frenzy of the gods and the songs of Homer. Muses, come to the sacred dance. Together we'll sing to the limits of song, you and I surrounded by you, with my hair flowing, Phoebus. Daimon, that were a man before, entering now a diviner rank, you became a daimon, when you loosed the chain of necessity that is the human being's lot, and from the tempestuous waves of embodiment had strength to swim, to reach the headland's shores, far from the shoals of the sinful. You set your foot on the sinuous path laid out for the pure in soul, where the light of the gods and their laws shows the way, innocent of, rising above the lawlessness of the sinful. While twisting to flee the bitter waves, where blood sustains and whirlpools menace, mid-torrent, amid deafening confusion, the God-sent goal would often be made to seem near. Often the darts which your intellect fired were borne by their very strength along deviant paths. The gods, then, shone focused rays of light which helped you to see from the gloomy shade, and raised you straight to the circling, the deathless path. The pleasure of sleep never wholly took hold of your eyes, the heavy bolt of its mist not allowed to seal your lids, so that, borne through the whirlpools, your eyes remained open to many and joyful things, things sought with difficulty by men who go after wisdom. But now that you have struck your tent, and left the grave of a daimon soul, you come among the assembly of daimons, refreshed by the lovely breezes. Where love is, where beautiful yearning is, full of pure joy, always replenished by deathless streams from God. From here come the rains of loves. From here the sweet breeze and calmness of ether. Here live the brothers of the golden generation of great Zeus, Minos and Rhadamanthus. Here lives the just Aeacus. Here are Plato's holy strength, and the beautiful Pythagoras, and those who started the dance of immortal love, and won for themselves a common lineage with the most blessed daimons. Here the heart is in good cheer, is always warmed and cheerful. O blessed one, how many contests you have endured! Go now among holy daimons, your turbid lives the crest on your helmet. Let us start the song and the wheeling dance for Plotinus, O muses, who pleases us, no less for the blessed from my golden lyre. These verses say that he was kindly, gentle, very kind and charming, which we knew him to be, and they say that he did not sleep, kept his soul pure, and was always striving for the divine which he loved with his whole soul, and that he did everything to transform himself, to flee the bitter waves of this life where blood sustains. So it is that this divine daimon of a man ascended in his thought to the first transcendent God many times, travelling the roads described by Plato in the Symposium, and to him appeared that God, who has neither shape nor form, who has his seat above intellect and every intelligible thing. I, Porphyry, now 67 years old, once drew near this God and was unified with him. Anyway, the goal appeared near. Plotinus, his aim or goal was to be unified and to be present to the God that is set over all things. This goal, an indescribable state of perfection, he achieved some 4 times while I was with him. Because he was born along deviant paths, the gods often put him straight by sending focused rays of light, so one might consider what he wrote as written under their protection and supervision. As Plotinus watched the world unseeingly, so his inner eye never slept. And this is why Apollo says, "Your eyes remained open to many and joyful things, things sought with difficulty, by men who apply themselves to philosophy." Human contemplation can transcend the merely human, but when it is compared to the knowledge of the gods, it is graceful perhaps, but not able to plumb the depths as they do. So much, then, for what the oracle shows about Plotinus's actions and achievements while still in the body. After being freed from the body, it says that he came to the assembly of daimons, where love and yearning are citizens, and that love which is kindled by God, as well as the so-called soul judges, those children of God, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus. He passes before them, not to have judgment passed on him, but in order to join them in the company of all the other great men. Plato and Pythagoras are among the sort of people there, and others who started the dance of immortal love. And there the most blessed of the daimons have their birth, and enter a life characterized by fulfillment and joy. They live out this life, being made happy by the gods. Such is our account of the life of Plotinus. He turned over to us the task of arranging and correcting his books, and I promised him while he was still alive that I would do this, and gave undertakings to his other associates too. So I decided, first of all, not to leave his books as they were, in the chronological order of their publication. In this I followed the example of Apollodorus of Athens and Andronicus the Peripatetic. The former collected the works of Epicharmus, the comic poet, in 10 volumes. The latter divided the works of Aristotle and Theophrastus into treatises, bringing related topics together. For my part, I hit on the pleasing idea of dividing the 54 books of Plotinus into 6 Enneads, groups of 9 multiplied by the perfect number 6. I collected related topics together in each Ennead, putting the less weighty questions first in their final order. Porphyry proceeds to describe the contents of each Ennead. The first Ennead comprises treatises on ethical topics. The second is a collection of physics, embracing works concerned with the cosmos and things contained within the cosmos. The third Ennead also deals with works on the cosmos. These 3 Enneads were put together and organized in one volume. We included on our allotted daimon in the third Ennead, because it deals with the matters concerning the daimon in general, and the question is related to those he addresses concerning the birth of human beings. Similarly, with on love, on eternity and time, we included here because time is a topic discussed here. On nature, contemplation, and the one is put here because of its treatment of nature, indicated by its title. The fourth Ennead contains works on the cosmos with writings on the soul. The fifth contains those dealing with the intellect and includes all the books which deal with what lies beyond, with the intellect in the soul, and with the ideas. The final, sixth Ennead makes another volume, so that Plotinus's work amounts to 3 volumes, of which the first contains 3 Enneads, the second 2, the third 1. This, then, is how we disposed Plotinus's 54 books in 6 Enneads. We set down notes for some of them, not systematically, but just as and when friends asked for something written down to help them understand a point. We also wrote key point summaries of all of the books except On Beauty, which we did not possess, based on the chronological order of their publication. But it is not only the substantive points of each book that are included in this, but their lines of argument too, which are numbered in the way as the summaries. But now it is our task to go through each of the books with an eye to establishing punctuation and correcting any mistakes there might be in the language. The work itself will show what has to be done. End of On the Life of Plotinus and the Order of His Books by Porphyry of Tyre.